Greetings, friends. I'm Vitaly Portnikov. During the initial encounter in a year between the Russian and Azerbaijani presidents, Russian President Vladimir Putin was compelled to apologize to Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev for the destruction of an Azerbaijani passenger liner, which was brought down by a Russian air defense system in the airspace of the Russian Federation. Putin offered these apologies in a manner that could be described as characteristically his own. He did not forget to bring up the Ukrainian drones that, as the Russian president asserted, were in the Russian Federation airspace at that very moment. He also contended that the aircraft suffered damage not from a direct impact, but from shrapnel from a Russian air defense missile. Nevertheless, the Russian president was forced to admit that the catastrophe was, in fact, caused by a Russian missile rather than by some Ukrainian drone, as he had initially suggested. And this, of course, differs significantly from the Russian assertions we heard after a Malaysian passenger liner was destroyed by a Russian missile. For several consecutive years, Moscow repeatedly claimed that the Ukrainian military was responsible for its demise and that a Russian missile caused the disaster, not some Ukrainian drone. Thus, Ilham Aliyev succeeded in obtaining from Vladimir Putin precisely what he wanted and what he had publicly demanded: an apology for the destruction of the aircraft and promises to hold those responsible for this tragedy accountable. And it is quite evident that for Putin, this particular statement was by no means merely the outcome of a Russian-Azerbaijani compromise, but rather a profound understanding of the undeniable fact that, without these crucial words, establishing and fostering amicable relations between Moscow and Baku would prove to be an exceedingly arduous and challenging endeavor. As is known, after the president of Azerbaijan reacted harshly to the lack of civilized behavior from Russia following the downing of the Azerbaijani passenger liner, Moscow attempted to resolve the situation not by trying to seek common ground with Baku, but through the pressure tactics the Kremlin is accustomed to. Repressions targeting representatives of the Azerbaijani diaspora in Russia, encompassing both Azerbaijani citizens and Russian citizens of Azerbaijani ethnic background, became a component of this coercive tactic. This served as a clear message designed to communicate to the Azerbaijani president that if he did not relinquish his claims, things would only deteriorate for him. Nevertheless, as we observe, Baku embraced this challenge. And Ilham Aliyev not only didn't back down from his strong stance concerning Putin, but he also undertook a whole series of actions that, to put it mildly, did not evoke great enthusiasm in the Russian capital. This also includes the detention of Russian spies who were operating in Azerbaijan under the guise of Rosotrudnichestvo, which is another disruptive, subversive organization typically utilized by the Kremlin for sabotage and destabilization in neighboring countries. It also includes direct communication with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This also represents a very clear demonstration of Azerbaijan's willingness to establish its position within organizations where Turkey, rather than Russia, assumes the primary leadership role. Ilham Aliyev arrived at that very summit in Dushanbe directly from a meeting with the leaders of Turkic world countries. This was followed by a joint trip to the United States with Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, where, in the presence of US President Donald Trump, the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia formally signed an agreement that essentially entrusts the United States with the intermediary mission of maintaining the security of transport routes which are intended to connect Azerbaijan with the Nakhchivan autonomy through the territory of Armenia. I'd like to remind you that it was the Russian Federation that was previously slated to act as the guarantor of security for these transport routes. And in the joint declaration issued by the Russian and Azerbaijani presidents and the Armenian Prime Minister, which was signed at the conclusion of the Second Karabakh War, it was asserted that these routes would be controlled by servicemen of the Federal Security Service of Russia, which is to say, essentially, by Putin's own personal militia. And it is evident that following this undeniable geopolitical setback for Moscow, Putin had no alternative but to seek common ground with his Azerbaijani counterpart, aiming to prevent the situation from worsening even further. The apology formulated by the Russian president for the Azerbaijani counterpart was evidently negotiated for quite a while. It is no coincidence that at the summit in China, where both presidents were in attendance, they did not hold a joint meeting. Rather, they merely limited themselves to a handshake. However, even then, it was evident that Vladimir Putin was striving to initiate a dialogue with the Azerbaijani leadership, particularly after he extended birthday greetings to the Azerbaijani president's wife. And just before the meeting in Dushanbe, Ilham Aliyev was one of the very few leaders of foreign countries who congratulated Vladimir Putin on his birthday. Apparently, the exact wording of the Russian president's apology to his Azerbaijani counterpart had already been settled by both delegations at that time. Even though the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Ilham Aliyev in Dushanbe wasn't confirmed until the very last minute, it is already quite clear that this particular encounter and the subsequent apologies will constitute the principal outcome of Vladimir Putin's attendance at the summit for the heads of the Commonwealth member states. And it is exactly this meeting, these apologies in particular, that will demonstrate the ongoing weakening of Russia's standing in the post-Soviet space, mainly stemming from the Russia-Ukraine war. Moscow simply doesn't possess the necessary resources for applying either military might or economic leverage against its neighboring nations. And Russia's neighbors in the former Soviet Union are readily taking advantage of the weakening of their former metropole. They are using this opportunity to forge diverse connections, establish new allied relationships, and address Moscow in a tone that, just a few years ago, would have been completely unthinkable. Putin is being compelled to acclimate himself to this kind of treatment. And this kind of treatment, this necessity to bow down to the leaders of neighboring countries, whom he previously wouldn't have paid much attention to, is also a direct consequence of his misadventure in Ukraine. Nearly all Russian resources are currently being diverted to the conflict with the neighboring country, as Putin loses standing in the world and finds himself among those who are actively seeking common ground with Chinese President Xi Jinping, because the Russian president, along with his deteriorating regime, is becoming increasingly reliant on him. For political figures such as Ilham Aliyev, it is entirely unclear why they should choose to turn a blind eye to traditional Russian rudeness and traditional Russian neglect. So, you could say that Putin got what was coming to him. And I think we will repeatedly witness not only his political humiliation, but also the humiliation of the Russian Federation itself, as the war with Ukraine continues and demonstrates the Kremlin's inability to achieve its ambitious yet unrealistic political objectives. Thank you, friends. Stay and subscribe to this channel. Also, subscribe to my social media, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and DENATELO channels that support these resources, and use YouTube's sponsorship function. Peace.